Morning mist clung to the Riverside Community Garden as the black Mercedes invaded its peaceful silence. 6A, the engine's purr died, replaced by the sharp staccato of designer heels on gravel. She emerged like a creature from another world, tailored charcoal suit, cutting through the soft greens and earth tones, her porcelain face a stark contrast to the weathered hands that tended this sacred ground. Luke Harrison's shovel paused mid-dig as he watched her survey his humble kingdom with eyes that had appraised billion-dollar deals. Her manicured fingers trembled against an expensive checkbook. "I want to rent a plot," she whispered, her boardroom authority cracking like autumn leaves. "I'll pay whatever you ask." The morning air seemed to hold its breath. "I only need 3 months. 3 months." The words fell between them like stones into still water, and Luke sensed this woman was drowning in something far deeper than money could ever reach. Luke straightened slowly, dirt cascading from his work gloves as he studied the stranger before him. The scent of rich soil and morning dew hung between them, punctuated by the expensive perfume that seemed to follow her like armor. She stood perfectly still except for those trembling fingers, her red-rimmed eyes betraying sleepless nights despite the flawless make-up. "This isn't a rental property, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is a community garden. We share the work, share the harvest." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The checkbook snapped shut with the finality of a closing vault. "Then teach me to share." The words hung in the air like an unexpected prayer, and Luke found himself nodding before his rational mind could object. Behind him, the screen door of his small apartment creaked open, and 8-year-old Ruby appeared on the wooden steps, her auburn hair still messy from sleep. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit against her pajamas, her wide green eyes taking in the strange tableau before her. "Daddy?" she called softly, her voice carrying the gentle uncertainty of a child who had learned too early that mornings could bring unexpected changes. The woman's head snapped toward Ruby with an almost violent intensity, her composure cracking further as she took in the sight of innocence wrapped in faded flannel. "Just a neighbor, baby girl," Luke called back, though something in his chest tightened as he spoke the lie. This woman was many things, but neighbor wasn't one of them. Ruby padded down the steps, bare feet finding purchase on the cool morning grass, and approached with the fearless curiosity that only children possessed. "Are you going to help Daddy with the vegetables?" she asked, tilting her head to study the expensive stranger. The woman's breath caught audibly, her hand rising toward her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. I don't know how to help with anything," she admitted, and for the first time, her voice carried no pretense, only raw honesty that seemed to surprise even herself. Luke watched the interaction unfold with growing fascination, recognizing something familiar in the woman's careful distance from his daughter. It was the same way he had behaved around children in those first horrible months after Caroline's death, as if proximity to innocence might shatter whatever fragile composure he had managed to construct. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said quietly, gesturing toward an empty plot near the garden's eastern edge. The morning sun was beginning to burn away the mist, revealing neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that dozens of families tended together. $10 a month. Standard rate." She opened the checkbook again, her movements sharp and decisive. "I'll pay for the entire year up front." The $100 bill she extracted seemed obscene, against the backdrop of honest soil and simple tools. Ruby giggled softly, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Daddy says money doesn't make plants grow faster," she announced with the absolute certainty of childhood wisdom. "Only love and water and sunshine do that." The woman stared at Ruby as if she had spoken in a foreign language, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together in confusion. Luke pocketed the $10 and handed back the rest, noting how her fingers lingered on the money, as if she couldn't quite believe someone would refuse what she was offering. "Keep the change for seeds," he suggested. "Nasturtiums grow fast. Ruby can show you how to plant them." The name fell from his lips before he could stop it. "I'm Luke, by the way. Luke Harrison." She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting between him and Ruby as if calculating some invisible risk. "Alex," she said finally. "Alex Miller." The lie tasted bitter even to Luke's ears, though he couldn't have said why he was so certain it was false. Everything about this woman screamed careful construction, from her flawless appearance to the way she held herself like someone perpetually on stage. But Ruby seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of deception, clapping her hands together with delight. "Miss Alex? That's a pretty name. Do you want to see my special flowers?" Before either adult could respond, Ruby had grabbed Alex's manicured hand with her own small, dirt-stained fingers, tugging her toward a corner of the garden where wild nasturtiums had begun to spread in a riot of orange and yellow blooms. Alex followed like someone in a trance, her expensive heels sinking into the soft earth with each reluctant step. Luke trailed behind them, ostensibly to supervise, but really to study this strange woman who had appeared in his sanctuary like a ghost seeking redemption. He watched her crouch beside Ruby, the movement awkward in her restrictive skirt, as his daughter chattered about soil pH and proper watering techniques with the enthusiasm of someone who had been raised in gardens rather than boardrooms. "These ones are volunteer flowers," Ruby explained, pointing to a particularly vibrant cluster. "That means nobody planted them, but they grew anyway because they wanted to be here." Alex's hand hovered over the blooms without quite touching them, as if she feared her presence might somehow contaminate their natural beauty. "How do you know they wanted to be here?" she asked, and Luke caught something desperate in her voice, as if Ruby's answer might hold the key to some cosmic mystery. Ruby considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Because growing is hard work," she said finally. "Plants only do hard work when they really, really want something." She picked one of the smaller blooms and held it out to Alex, who stared at the simple offering as if it were made of precious metal. "You can have this one. Daddy says flowers are meant to be shared." Alex's fingers closed around the stem with infinite care, and Luke saw her throat work as she swallowed what might have been tears. The morning sun caught the delicate petals, transforming them into tiny flames of color against her pale skin. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time since her arrival, her voice carried no weight of careful control, only genuine gratitude that seemed to surprise them all. The weeks that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm that defied Luke's every assumption about the mysterious woman who had claimed a corner of his world. Alex appeared each morning at precisely 6 o'clock, her expensive car looking increasingly out of place among the pickup trucks and sensible sedans of the other gardeners. She traded her business suits for dark jeans and simple blouses, though Luke noticed she never quite managed to look comfortable in casual clothes, as if informality were a costume that didn't quite fit. Her hands remained soft despite her daily work in the soil, and she wore her gardening gloves with the same precision she had once applied to her morning makeup routine. Ruby had appointed herself Alex's unofficial teacher, a role she embraced with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had the opportunity to be the expert. She demonstrated proper seed spacing with the patience of a saint, her small hands guiding Alex's uncertain movements as they planted row after row of nasturtium seeds in the carefully prepared bed. "You have to press down just enough to say hello to the soil," Ruby explained, her serious expression making Luke smile despite his growing confusion about their strange new volunteer. Alex followed each instruction with the focused intensity of someone studying for a critical exam, taking notes in a leather-bound journal that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Luke found himself watching their interactions with fascination tinged by concern. There was something almost desperate in the way Alex absorbed Ruby's lessons, as if each piece of gardening wisdom were a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water. She asked endless questions about growth cycles and soil composition, her sharp intelligence evident even when applied to subjects far removed from whatever world she had emerged from. "How long before they bloom?" she asked one morning, kneeling beside the neat rows they had planted together. Ruby counted on her fingers with exaggerated concentration. "Maybe 4 weeks if we're really good to them," she announced. "But sometimes plants have their own ideas about timing." But Alex nodded gravely, as if this were the most important deadline she had ever faced. The other gardeners accepted Alex's presence with the easy tolerance of people accustomed to newcomers seeking solace in growing things. Mrs. Anderson, an elderly widow who tended prize-winning roses, offered advice about organic pest control with the same kindness she showed everyone. Old Frank, whose tomatoes were legendary throughout the county, shared his secrets about proper pruning with anyone willing to listen. Beth Walker, a single mother whose twin boys treated the garden like their personal playground, simply nodded when Alex appeared each morning and continued her own quiet work among the herbs and vegetables that helped stretch her grocery budget. But Luke sensed undercurrents beneath Alex's careful integration into their small community. She flinched whenever anyone asked about her work or her family, deflecting questions with the skill of someone who had spent years navigating conversations where the wrong word might prove costly. She never mentioned friends or relatives, never spoke of plans beyond the immediate future of their shared garden plot. Most telling of all, she never stayed beyond mid-morning, as if longer exposure to their simple world might somehow prove dangerous to whatever carefully constructed life awaited her beyond the garden gates. 3 weeks into their strange partnership, Luke arrived early to find Alex already at work, her movements sharp and agitated as she attacked the weeds that had dared to appear overnight among their nascent nasturtium seedlings. She had abandoned her gloves, and her hands were stained with soil and something that might have been tears. The leather journal lay open beside her, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze like captured birds seeking escape. Luke approached carefully, recognizing the particular fury of someone fighting battles that had nothing to do with garden maintenance. "Rough night?" he asked quietly, settling beside her on the wooden bench he had built the previous summer. Alex's hands stilled on the soil, but she didn't look up. "Do you ever feel like you're running out of time?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the gentle morning sounds of awakening birds and distant traffic. The question carried weight far beyond its simple words, and Luke found himself considering it with the seriousness it deserved. "Every day since Caroline died," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. Like there's this countdown clock somewhere, and I can't see the numbers, but I can hear it ticking. Alex finally lifted her head, and he saw something raw and desperate in her eyes that made his chest tighten with recognition. "How do you stand it?" she whispered. "How do you keep going when you know everything you touch turns to dust eventually?" The question hung between them like a confession, and Luke felt the first real stirring of understanding about what had driven this polished stranger to seek refuge in their humble garden. "You focus on what grows instead of what dies," he said finally, gesturing toward the neat rows where tiny green shoots were already pushing through the dark soil with determined optimism. Caroline used to say that gardens are proof that endings and beginnings are really the same thing, just viewed from different angles. Alex stared at the emerging seedlings as if seeing them for the first time, her breathing shallow and quick. "I don't know how to see beginnings anymore," she admitted. "I only know how to calculate endings." The leather journal fluttered again in the breeze, and Luke caught a glimpse of neat columns filled with numbers and dates that looked more like spreadsheets than garden notes. Before he could process what he had seen, the sound of footsteps on gravel announced Ruby's arrival, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she ran toward them with the boundless energy of childhood mornings. "Miss Alex! Miss Alex!" she called, her voice bright with excitement. "I brought you something special." She skidded to a halt beside their bench, digging through her backpack with the focused determination of someone on an important mission. From its depths, she produced a small plastic container that had once held yogurt but now cradled a tiny nasturtium seedling, its first true leaves unfurling like miniature flags of hope. "I started this one in my bedroom window," Ruby explained proudly. "It's ahead of all the others because I talked to it every night before bed. Daddy says plants like bedtime stories just as much as kids do." Alex accepted the small gift with hands that trembled slightly, cradling the plastic container as if it contained something infinitely precious. "You grew this for me?" she asked, her voice thick with an emotion Luke couldn't quite identify. Ruby nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the profound impact of her simple gesture. "I wanted you to have the very first bloom," she explained with the generosity that children possessed before the world taught them to hoard their treasures. "By the time all our garden flowers start blooming, this one will be the biggest and most beautiful because it had extra love." Alex stared at the tiny plant for a long moment, her throat working as she struggled with words that seemed too large for her voice. "I've never had anyone grow something just for me," she finally managed, and Luke heard decades of loneliness compressed into those simple words. The morning that changed everything arrived exactly 4 weeks after Alex's first appearance, announced by the urgent sound of Luke's phone buzzing against the wooden workbench where he kept his tools. Ruby was already at the garden, tending to her special nasturtium seedling with the devoted attention of a mother caring for a newborn, while Alex knelt nearby, sketching the emerging blooms in her leather journal with surprising artistic skill. The caller ID showed a number Luke didn't recognize, but something about its insistence made him answer despite his general policy of ignoring unknown calls during garden time. "Mr. Harrison?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the particular authority that came from expensive education and frequent use. "This is James Mitchell from Sterling Technologies. I need to speak with you about Alexandra Sterling immediately." The name hit Luke like cold water, washing away weeks of careful assumptions and replacing them with a clarity so sudden and complete that he wondered how he had ever believed in Alex Miller. He turned to look at the woman, kneeling among their shared nasturtiums, seeing her now with eyes cleared of willful blindness. The expensive car, the designer clothes disguised as casual wear, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to boardrooms and bottom lines, the careful distance she maintained from any conversation that might reveal too much about her real life. Most damning of all, the desperate intensity with which she had thrown herself into their simple garden world, as if it were her last chance at something she had never known how to find. "I'm afraid you have the wrong number," Luke said carefully, his eyes never leaving Alex's bent figure. "I don't know anyone by that name." "Mr. Harrison, please," the voice pressed on with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Alexandra Sterling is the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the Midwest. She's been missing from her office for weeks, and her assistant tracked her car to your location through GPS monitoring. This is a matter of corporate security and fiduciary responsibility." Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach, as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly clicked into place. Sterling Technologies, the company that had purchased Riverside Manufacturing 6 months ago, laying off 300 local workers in the name of operational efficiency. The company whose logo had appeared on termination letters that had landed on kitchen tables throughout their small community like bombs disguised as business correspondents. "Sir?" The voice on the phone had taken on an edge of impatience. "Mr. Harrison, are you still there?" Luke watched as Alex looked up from her sketching, her eyes finding his across the garden with an intuition that spoke of weeks spent learning to read his moods and expressions. The moment their gazes met, he saw her face drain of color, saw her hand freeze over the journal page where she had been capturing the delicate beauty of blooms that would outlive whatever storm was about to break over their carefully constructed piece. "She's not here," Luke said finally, ending the call before the voice could protest further. But Alex was already standing, already backing away from the nasturtium bed, as if proximity to their shared creation might somehow contaminate it with the truth of who she really was. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the way her hands shook as she closed the leather journal and held it against her chest like armor. Ruby looked up from her tending with the quick alertness of a child who had learned to sense adult tension even when she couldn't understand its source. Luke pocketed his phone and walked slowly toward Alex, noting how she retreated with each step he took, as if they were performing some choreographed dance of approach and avoidance. "I suspected from the beginning," he admitted, "but I didn't want to know. I told myself it didn't matter who you were, only who you were becoming." The morning sun caught the tears that had begun to track down Alex's cheeks, making them shine like silver against her pale skin. "It matters," she said quietly. "It matters more than you know." Ruby abandoned her seedling and ran to Alex's side, her small hand reaching for the woman's free one with the instinctive comfort that children offered without calculation or judgment. "Miss Alex, why are you crying?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "Did something hurt you?" Alex looked down at Ruby with an expression so full of love and loss that Luke felt his own chest tighten in response. "I hurt people, sweetheart," Alex said, her voice breaking on the endearment. "I hurt a lot of people, and I'm afraid that being near me might hurt you too." Ruby's brow furrowed in the serious way it did when she encountered concepts too large for her 8-year-old understanding, but too important to dismiss. But you're learning to grow things, she protested with the logic of innocence. People who grow things can't be all bad. Can they, Daddy? The question hung in the morning air like a challenge, and Luke found himself face to face with a choice that would define not only his own future, but the futures of everyone he cared about. He looked at Alexandra Sterling, CEO and architect of local devastation, and saw not the corporate villain his rational mind insisted she must be, but the lost woman who had spent weeks learning to coax life from soil, who had listened to Ruby's lessons with the attention of someone discovering religion, who had sketched nasturtium blooms with the reverence of someone creating sacred art. Ruby's right, he said finally, the words emerging from someplace deeper than conscious thought. People who grow things understand that destruction is just another word for making room for something better. Alex stared at him with the expression of someone who had just been offered a lifeline by the very person she had expected to throw her overboard. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Sterling Technology's my company. We bought Riverside Manufacturing. The layoffs, the families who lost their jobs. That was me. That was my decision." Her voice cracked on the words, and Luke saw years of guilt and isolation crystallizing into this moment of confession. 300 people lost their jobs because of me. 300 families had their lives turned upside down so that shareholders could see better quarterly returns. How can you stand here and talk about growing things when I've spent my entire career cutting them down? The pain in her voice was so raw, so immediate, that Luke felt it echo in his own chest like a physical blow. But alongside the pain, he heard something else, something that sounded almost like hope, as if confession might somehow lead to absolution. "Because you're here," he said simply. "Because you left your boardroom and your bottom line and came looking for something you couldn't buy or calculate or control. Because for the past month, you've been learning to create instead of destroy. And maybe that's not an accident. Maybe that's the point." He gestured toward the nasturtium bed where Ruby knelt, still tending her special seedling with the focused devotion that had drawn Alex into their world in the first place. "You want to know why I can stand here? Because I watched my wife die from cancer that insurance companies decided was too expensive to treat properly. Because I know what it feels like to watch everything you love get reduced to numbers on someone else's spreadsheet." Alex's breath caught audibly, her hand rising to cover her mouth as the implications of his words settled over her like falling snow. "Oh God," she whispered. "Sterling Technologies owns shares in Mercy Hospital Group. The insurance restrictions, the treatment limitations, I signed off on those cost-cutting measures. I ... quote." Her voice failed entirely, and she swayed as if the weight of connection had physically staggered her. Luke saw the moment when intellectual understanding became emotional reality, when abstract corporate decisions transformed into personal responsibility for tangible loss. "You're telling me," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "that I am responsible for your wife's death, that my cost-cutting measures killed Caroline." The words hung between them like a verdict, and Luke felt the foundations of their carefully built relationship shifting beneath his feet. "No," he said firmly, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "Caroline's cancer killed Caroline. Insurance companies and corporate policies and treatment limitations, those things made it harder, made it more expensive, made it more painful for all of us. But they didn't kill her." He took a step closer to Alex, noting how she flinched but didn't retreat further. You want to know what I learned from watching Caroline die? I learned that being angry at the system that failed her was just another way of dying myself. I learned that the only way to honor her memory was to find ways to build instead of tear down, to create instead of destroy. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, finding conviction in words he hadn't known he believed until they emerged from his mouth. You can't change what you did before, but you can change what you do next. Ruby had been listening with the intense focus that children brought to adult conversations they sensed were important even when they couldn't follow every nuance. Now she stood and walked to Alex with the fearless determination that had characterized her approach to everything since her mother's death. "Miss Alex," she said, reaching up to take the woman's hand. "Daddy taught me that mistakes are just practice for getting things right. Maybe you practiced being mean before, but now you're practicing being nice. That's what gardens are for, practicing growing things until you get good at it." She smiled up at Alex with the radiant confidence of someone who had never doubted that people could change, that redemption was as natural and inevitable as seedlings reaching toward sunlight. Alex sank to her knees in the soft earth, bringing herself to Ruby's eye level as tears streamed freely down her face. "What if I've been practicing being mean for so long that I've forgotten how to be anything else?" she asked, her voice raw with vulnerability. Ruby considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "Then you practice extra hard," she said finally. "Like when I was learning to ride my bike and I kept falling down. Daddy said the falling down was just my bike teaching me how to stay up. Maybe being mean was just life teaching you how to be nice." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Besides, you've been nice to me every single day since you got here. So I think you remember just fine." The simple wisdom of childhood hung in the morning air like a benediction, and Luke felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a debt that needed clearing, but something deeper and more fundamental. A recognition that the woman kneeling in his garden, crying over his daughter's offered grace, was not the same person who had signed corporate memos and approved cost-cutting measures from the distant safety of a boardroom. "Alexandra," he said, using her real name for the first time. "What did the doctors tell you?" "About the 3 months?" Because suddenly the timeline made sense. The desperate intensity with which she had thrown herself into their garden world, the way she had absorbed Ruby's lessons as if they were the most important education she had ever received. Alex's shoulders sagged, as if the question had removed the last of her carefully maintained defenses. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the morning sounds of birds and distant traffic. "Diagnosed 6 months ago. They said 3 to 6 months, depending on how aggressively I wanted to fight it. I chose not to fight. I chose to come here instead." She looked up at Luke with eyes that held no self-pity, only a bone-deep weariness that spoke of someone who had carried the weight of impossible decisions for far too long. "I wanted to learn how to create something beautiful before I die. I wanted to matter to someone in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. I wanted." Her voice broke again, and she struggled visibly to find words adequate to her need. "I wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for something other than what I could provide." The confession settled over them like morning mist, touching everything and changing the very air they breathed. Luke felt the last of his protective anger dissolve, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more complex. He looked at this woman who had deceived him about her identity, but had been heartbreakingly honest about everything that mattered, who had spent her final months learning to tend nasturtiums instead of attending board meetings, who had chosen his daughter's love over whatever connections her wealth and power might have provided. "You don't have 3 months," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "You have today. You have right now. You have whatever time you spend creating instead of destroying, building instead of tearing down." He gestured toward the neat rows of nasturtiums that were already beginning to show the first hints of buds among their bright green leaves. "You have whatever grows from what you plant here." Ruby, who had been listening with the intense absorption that children brought to conversations they sensed would reshape their world, suddenly clapped her hands together with delight. "Miss Alex is going to stay," she announced with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "She's going to help us with the Harvest Festival, and she's going to teach me how to draw flowers like she does in her book, and she's going to be here when all our nasturtiums bloom." The enthusiasm in her voice was infectious, and despite everything, the revelations, the confessions, the weight of shared loss and unexpected connection, Luke found himself smiling. "Is that what you want?" he asked Alex quietly. "To stay and see what grows?" Alex looked from him to Ruby, then toward the garden where dozens of other plots held the hopes and dreams of families who had found solace in the simple act of nurturing growing things. "I want to try to be worthy of what you're offering," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to track down her cheeks. "I want to learn how to build instead of destroy. I want to help Ruby's nasturtiums bloom, and I want to find ways to give back to the community I damaged." She paused, drawing a shaky breath before continuing. "I want to use whatever time I have left to be someone Caroline would have been proud to know." The words hit Luke like a physical blow, not because they were painful, but because they were exactly what Caroline would have said in similar circumstances. His wife had possessed an almost supernatural ability to see potential for redemption in the most unlikely places, to believe that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves if given the right combination of love and opportunity. "Then we have work to do," Luke said, extending his hand to help Alex to her feet. "Starting with figuring out how to turn a technology company into something that builds communities instead of destroying them." Alex stared at his offered hand for a long moment, as if accepting it would constitute a contract more binding than any legal document she had ever signed. Then, slowly she reached out and let him pull her upright, her fingers closing around his with the tentative strength of someone taking the first step on a journey she couldn't yet imagine. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "I've spent my entire career learning how to maximize profit and minimize overhead. I don't know how to measure success in anything other than quarterly returns." "Then it's a good thing you have teachers," Ruby piped up, beaming at both adults with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Daddy can teach you about taking care of people, and I can teach you about growing things, and maybe the garden can teach you about how endings and beginnings are really the same thing." She reached for Alex's free hand, creating a small circle of connection among the nasturtium beds. "Besides, you're already good at the most important part." Alex looked down at Ruby with confusion. "What part is that?" Ruby's smile widened to encompass her entire face. "You know how to love the growing." 6 months later, the Riverside Community Garden had expanded to encompass 3 full city blocks, funded by an anonymous donation that had appeared just weeks after Alex's confession in the form of a $50 million community development grant. The Sterling Technologies Worker Recovery Fund had helped 237 families transition to new careers, with job training programs, healthcare coverage, and housing assistance that addressed the real needs of real people rather than the abstract requirements of corporate social responsibility reports. Alex had stepped down as CEO, transferring controlling interest in the company to a community trust that prioritized local investment and worker ownership over maximum profit extraction. Luke found her on a warm September morning, kneeling among the nasturtium beds that had grown into a cascade of orange and yellow blooms that drew visitors from 3 counties away. She was thinner now, her movements careful in ways that spoke of pain she tried to hide, but her hands were steady as she sketched the intricate patterns of light and shadow that played across the flowers Ruby had chosen for her 6 months earlier. The leather journal had been joined by several others, each filled with detailed observations about plant growth, weather patterns, and the subtle changes that marked the progression of seasons in their shared sanctuary. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench that had become their traditional meeting place for the conversations that mattered most. Alex looked up from her sketching with a smile that held none of the careful construction he had learned to recognize in those early weeks. "Grateful," she said simply. "Tired, but grateful." She gestured toward the garden that stretched around them, alive with the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of adults who had found peace in the simple act of tending growing things. "I never thought I'd live to see the Harvest Festival. I certainly never imagined I'd live to see this place become what it's become." Ruby emerged from behind a particularly spectacular display of sunflowers, her arms full of blooms destined for the bouquets they would distribute at the festival later that afternoon. At 10 years old, she had grown into her role as the garden's unofficial ambassador, teaching newcomers the basics of soil preparation and seed planting with the same patience Alex had once shown her. "Miss Alex," she called, her voice bright with excitement. "Mrs. Henderson wants to know if you'll judge the nasturtium competition this year. She says you're the expert now." Alex laughed, a sound that had become increasingly rare as her condition progressed, but no less beautiful for its scarcity. "I think Mrs. Henderson may be overestimating my expertise," she said. "All I did was learn to pay attention to what was already there." "That's what makes someone an expert," Luke said quietly, watching as Ruby arranged her armload of sunflowers with the artistic sensibility she had inherited from her mother, and refined through months of learning from Alex's careful observation. Knowing how to see what others miss, knowing how to help something reach its potential. He looked at Alex with an expression that held months of shared mornings, difficult conversations, and the particular intimacy that came from watching someone transform themselves from the inside out. "You've become quite good at helping things reach their potential." Alex closed her journal and leaned back against the bench, her face turned toward the September sun that painted everything golden and soft. "I used to think success meant controlling outcomes," she said thoughtfully. "Maximizing efficiency, minimizing variables, ensuring predictable returns on investment. But gardens taught me that success might actually mean creating conditions where beautiful things can happen, then getting out of the way and letting them grow." She watched as Ruby began distributing her sunflowers to the other gardeners, each bloom received with the appreciation that came from understanding how much work and patience had gone into its creation. I spent 40 years trying to control everything and everyone around me. It took dying to teach me how to live." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Luke felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came from knowing their time together was measured in weeks rather than months. Alex's condition had progressed exactly as the doctors had predicted, but she had filled her remaining time with such intensity and purpose that sometimes he forgot she was dying until he saw her struggle with tasks that had once been effortless. "Any regrets?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Alex considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Only that I waited so long to start," she said finally. "I wish I had found you and Ruby and this place when I was 25 instead of 38. Think of all the growing we could have done together. The Harvest Festival that afternoon drew over 500 visitors, transforming the expanded garden into a celebration of community resilience and shared abundance that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier." Luke watched Alex move through the crowd with the careful grace of someone managing pain, but determined not to let it define her interactions. She spoke with families whose lives had been disrupted by Sterling Technologies' layoffs, listening to their stories with the attention of someone who understood that acknowledgement was sometimes more valuable than apology. She judged the nasturtium competition with the serious consideration of someone who had learned to see beauty in the smallest details, awarding first prize to a 7-year-old girl whose enthusiasm had produced blooms more abundant than technically perfect. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber that matched the nasturtiums that had started everything, Luke found Alex sitting alone among the flowers that had become her legacy. Ruby was nearby, showing a group of younger children how to collect seeds for next year's planting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned from the best teachers. "Thank you," Alex said quietly as Luke approached, her words carrying the weight of months of gratitude for second chances and unexpected grace. "For seeing who I could become instead of who I had been. For letting me love Ruby. For teaching me that redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you practice every day until it becomes who you are." Luke settled beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to treasure these quiet moments between the demands of community leadership and single parenthood. "Thank you for choosing to stay," he said. "For choosing to grow instead of just counting down days. For showing Ruby that people can change, that love is something you create rather than something you find." He looked toward his daughter, who was now demonstrating proper seed-saving techniques with the confidence of someone who knew her knowledge would outlive her teachers. "Caroline would have loved you," he said finally. "Not despite who you were, but because of who you chose to become." The words settled between them like a benediction, carrying all the weight of shared loss and unexpected love that had grown from soil prepared by grief and tended by hope. As the last light faded from the garden and the festival visitors began to drift toward their cars and homes, Alex reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope that bore Ruby's name in her careful handwriting. "For her 18th birthday," she explained. "Legal documents transferring ownership of Sterling Technologies to a trust in her name, with you as trustee until she comes of age, along with a letter explaining what she taught me about growing things." She smiled at Luke's shocked expression. "Ruby was right about practice making perfect. I practiced being mean for 40 years, then practiced being better for 6 months. I want her to have the resources to practice being extraordinary for the rest of her life. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first frost had touched the edges of the nasturtium leaves but left their centers still bright with defiant color, Alex died peacefully in her sleep in the small apartment she had rented within walking distance of the garden. Luke found her note on the kitchen table when he came to check on her after she failed to appear for their morning ritual of coffee and planning. "The nasturtiums will reseed themselves," she had written in her precise handwriting. "Love is the only thing that grows when you give it away. Thank you for teaching me how to plant it everywhere I went." The memorial service filled the garden to overflowing, drawing mourners from 3 states who had been touched by Alex's transformation from corporate executive to community builder. Ruby spoke about learning to see beginnings instead of endings, her young voice carrying the wisdom that had originally drawn Alex into their world. Luke read from the journals Alex had filled with observations about growth and change, sharing her insights about the connections between tending gardens and tending souls. The nasturtium seeds they scattered that day would ensure that her chosen flowers would return each spring, creating an endless cycle of renewal that honored her memory while reaching toward futures she would never see. 5 years later, the Alexandra Sterling Memorial Garden occupied 15 acres of what had once been industrial wasteland, supporting over 300 families and serving as a model for community development projects in 47 cities. Ruby, now 15 and college-bound on a full scholarship funded by the Sterling Foundation, still maintained the original nasturtium bed where everything had begun. She had inherited Alex's gift for seeing potential in unlikely places, her journals filled with observations about the relationships between social justice and soil health, economic development, and ecological restoration. Luke often found himself returning to the wooden bench where he and Alex had shared their most important conversations, especially on mornings when the light fell just right across the flowers she had chosen for her legacy. Sometimes he could almost hear her voice in the wind that moved through the nasturtium vines, reminding him that endings and beginnings were really the same thing viewed from different angles, that love was indeed the only thing that grew when you gave it away. The woman who had arrived in their garden as a stranger seeking redemption had become the architect of a transformation that would outlive them all, proving that it was never too late to learn how to plant hope in soil prepared by loss and tended by the endless human capacity for growth. The nasturtiums bloomed again each spring, their bright faces turning toward the sun with the same determination that had brought Alex to their garden in search of something she couldn't name but had learned to nurture. In their persistent return, Luke found the answer to the question she had asked that first morning about running out of time. "You didn't run out of time. You invested it in things that would keep growing long after you were gone, creating a legacy measured not in years, but in the lives you touched and the love you planted in soil that would remember your hands long after they were still."